Cowboys are remembered as heroes, wild men riding freely across endless plains. But the real story is much darker than anyone imagines. Behind every dusty hat, behind every sunset ride, was a life filled with hunger, storms, fear, and pain. For many cowboys, the open land wasn't freedom, it was a battlefield. And the truth is painful. Their life often felt worse than death. People imagine cowboys as free spirits riding across golden plains, but the truth is far from heroic. Most cowboys didn't choose this life. This life chose them. They were poor young men, orphans, immigrants, and wanderers who had nowhere else to go. They took the job because it was the only chance to survive, even if survival meant living in pain every single day. Every morning, before the sun even touched the sky, cowboys woke up with stiff backs, dry mouths, and aching muscles. Their clothes, still dusty from yesterday's ride, felt rough against their skin. Their boots were cracked. Their hands were sore. Their eyes carried the heaviness of sleepless nights. The open plains looked beautiful from far away, but for cowboys, those endless landscapes were a giant battlefield. They worked in heat that burned their skin, in cold that froze their bones, and in winds that carried dust sharp enough to cut their eyes. Their horses were tired, and their bodies even more so. They traveled for days without seeing another human, just cattle, dust, wind, and silence. The silence was the worst. It reminded them how alone they truly were. And yet every morning they forced themselves to stand up, saddle their horse, and ride into another day of hardship. Not because they were brave, not because they loved adventure, but because they had no other choice. Their life had one rule: survive today so you can suffer again tomorrow. This was the beginning of a cowboy's journey, a journey that felt less like a life and more like a slow, painful punishment.
Cowboy life didn't begin with adventure. It began with work, endless, painful work that never stopped. As soon as the sun rose, cowboys mounted their horses and rode toward the herds. Thousands of cattle stretched across the plains like a moving sea, and every single animal was a responsibility. If even one cow wandered off, the cowboy could be punished, fired, or left alone in the wilderness to find it. And searching for a lost cow often meant riding miles under brutal sunlight with no water, no shade, and no rest. The cattle were unpredictable. They kicked, charged, and panicked at the slightest noise. A cowboy could be crushed under hooves in seconds, and the herd wouldn't stop. Still, cowboys rode beside them every day, pushing them forward, guiding their direction, whistling, yelling, swinging ropes, all while their bodies begged for rest. Their horses suffered too. A cowboy had to take care of his horse before himself, feeding it, brushing it, checking its legs, because without the horse, the cowboy had nothing. Dust storms made herding nearly impossible. Wind would blind the cowboys, cattle would scatter, and riders would shout into the chaos, hoping their voice reached someone. But most days, no voice answered, because cowboys were spread miles apart, each one alone with the herd, alone with his thoughts, alone with the pain. By noon, their faces were burning, their shirts soaked in sweat, their boots filled with dust and stones. But the day wasn't even half over. This wasn't freedom. This wasn't adventure. This was labor that broke men slowly and turned their days into suffering.
Cowboys didn't just battle the desert. They battled the cattle they lived with every single day. The herd was always there, Thousands of cattle moving like a restless ocean, snorting, stomping, kicking, and breathing dust into the air. A cowboy could never forget them because they were never more than a few feet away. Their bodies were exhausted before the day even began. Their legs burned from riding beside the herd for hours. Their hands tore open from gripping ropes and pulling stubborn cattle who refused to move. If the cattle scattered, the cowboy had to chase them for miles. If they panicked, the cowboy had to calm them. If one cow stumbled or fell, the cowboy had to stop everything and fix the problem. The herd controlled the cowboy's life. Every time he turned around, everywhere he looked, there were cattle, pushing forward, wandering off, or watching him with blank, heavy eyes. Even the silence was filled with the sound of cattle breathing, cattle hooves stomping, cattle shaking dust off their backs. Cowboys rode through plains with the herd stretching endlessly beside them. Heat waves shimmered across their backs. Dust clouds rose from their hooves. And behind every cow was another cow, and another, and another. There was no escape. Sometimes cowboys whispered to their horses just to feel less alone, because the only living creatures near them were cattle and their tired horse. No humans, no voices, just the herd. Every mile they rode, the cattle walked beside them. Every night they camped, the cattle slept nearby. Every storm they faced, the cattle panicked around them. Cowboys lived with cattle. They worked with cattle. They suffered because of cattle. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't adventure. It was survival, with the herd that never left their side.
As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, the plains turned cold and unsettling. This was the time cowboys feared the most, nightfall. During the day, the herd was loud and alive, but at night, the cattle grew restless. Shadows stretched long across the ground. Wolves howled in the distance. Coyotes circled silently, and every noise made the cattle twitch, snort, or rise in panic. Cowboys didn't sleep, not really. They rested for a few minutes at a time, lying beside their tired horses, ears wide open to the sounds of thousands of cattle all around them. Every crackling twig, every distant animal cry, every shifting hoof could turn into disaster. A single frightened cow could start a stampede, and a stampede could kill dozens of cattle and the cowboy himself in seconds. So cowboys walked around the herd at night, humming softly, whistling gently, or tapping rhythmically on tin cups just to calm the cattle enough to survive until morning. The cold was harsh. The wind cut through their thin clothes. Their hands went numb, their noses burned, and their breath fogged the air. Sometimes they leaned against their horses for warmth. Sometimes they sat by a tiny fire, surrounded by cattle lying in a perfect circle around them, their only protection in the freezing dark. And the loneliness was unbearable. The stars were bright, the world silent, and the cowboy was just one small soul in an endless, unforgiving land, surrounded by cattle that depended on him even when he had nothing left to give. Night after night, storm after storm, fear after fear, this life broke cowboys silently. This wasn't adventure, this wasn't glory, this was survival in the darkest hours of the American frontier.
By the 5th day on the trail, the cowboy wasn't just tired in his body, his mind was beginning to crack. Hours and hours of watching cattle, listening to their footsteps, their snorts, their endless movement, it all blended into one long, painful blur. He rode beside the herd with half-closed eyes, barely aware of where he was. His horse nudged him twice, as if reminding him to stay awake, because the cattle were drifting too close to thorn bushes. The cowboy yanked his reins, rode in front of the herd, and waved his arms to redirect the animals before their legs got cut by the sharp desert thorns. A young cow suddenly lay down, too exhausted to walk. The cowboy stopped, dismounted, and kneeled beside the animal. He placed both hands under its jaw and spoke softly, urging it to rise. The herd slowed behind him. Dozens of heavy bodies moved restlessly, sniffing the air, waiting for the cowboy to fix the problem, but the young cow didn't move. The cowboy pressed his forehead against the animal and sighed deeply. He pushed gently on its shoulder again and again, until finally, with trembling legs, the cow rose shakily to its feet. The cowboy smiled weakly, but as he stood up, his knees buckled and he fell to the ground. His horse stepped closer, lowering its head as if checking on him. He wiped his face, climbed back onto his horse, and forced himself to ride again. The plains stretched endlessly, and the herd followed him faithfully. His body was suffering, but his mind was suffering more. Cowboys didn't break in storms. They broke in silence, in the long, empty space. The sun barely touched the horizon as the cowboy and his herd trudged across the endless plains. It had been a week without proper rest, a week without comfort or sleep. The cowboy's body screamed for rest, but he couldn't afford to stop. His horse was worn down, its breathing heavy and uneven. The cattle, too, showed signs of exhaustion, their movements sluggish, their eyes dull. A small creek appeared on the horizon, a sign of life in the barren wasteland, but the cowboy knew better than to get excited too soon. The creek was shallow, the water muddy, and the cattle wouldn't drink it unless the cowboy led them directly. As he rode forward, he saw a small patch of green, fresh grass, a sign of hope. The cowboy urged his horse forward, knowing that the herd needed to graze. It was their only chance to gain strength. As the cattle fed, the cowboy sat on a rock, his hands trembling as he took out his tattered map. His mind wandered to the past, to days when he was just a boy dreaming of adventure. Now the dream had become a nightmare. His life was spent in the service of the herd. It wasn't the glory he had imagined. It wasn't the excitement he had hoped for. It was endless days of suffering, sacrificing his body and mind for the survival of the animals he was responsible for. But in that moment, as the herd fed, the cowboy realized that survival was all that mattered. It wasn't about glory. It wasn't about fame. It was about keeping the herd alive, no matter the cost. And as the night settled in, he knew he had no choice but to keep moving. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another day of pain. But the cowboy understood. This was his life now.